Okay, welcome everyone. I'm gonna wait another minute, and then we'll get started on things. Oh. Hey, thanks, Tyler. So it looks like it's 1 o'clock now, so I'm gonna get going. My name is Blake Sexton. I'm the education coordinator here at Prickly Pear Land Trust. And today we're going to go over a quick lesson on pollinators and native plants and coevolution of pollinators with native plants. So how do pollinators affect the shape, structure, and color of some of the plants we see around us in the Helena area? So before we start, just real quick housekeeping. There'll be a very short assignment. To go along with this lesson, there's a link to the Google form where you can do a survey for the lesson and do the assignment attached below. Tyler should have also sent you a link along with this video. So I'd appreciate if you took that survey after watching the video. So this is the first image of that we're looking at here, and this is a really great example of a co-evolved plant. So if we squint at this image, kind of what does it look like to you guys? And what it should look like is kind of this this bee, right? It looks like maybe a bee from above you could fly, and it's got this fuzzy area around it. And this is really, I don't know if the term catfish is still popularly used, but this is like the catfish of the natural world. This plant has evolved to pretend like it is a bee, to get a bee to land on it, and eventually pollinate the plant. So today's lesson we're going to talk about how this happens. How does a plant evolve to be so specialized for a single pollinator? And to do that, we're going to have to talk about the reproduction of a plant really briefly. Throughout this presentation, let me know if there's any questions that come up. I'm happy to answer them live as it goes on. If not, feel free to email me or message me. So first we're going to go over a quick anatomy of a flower. So this is a perfect flower. No offense to other flowers. A perfect flower is just a flower that has both male and female reproductive systems intact. It's easier to study this way. So we're first going to look at the female reproductive system of a flower, and there's three main parts. So you have the style, which is this large central vase organ in the middle that contains the ovary, and the ovary is where the fertilization of the seed occurs and where the seed creation occurs. So we'll look at that in a second. And then up top at the style you have the stigma, which is the sticky area that catches the pollen. And we'll talk about what pollen is in a second. Together, the female reproductive organ is known as the pistil. So if you hear that, we're talking about the female reproductive organ. The male reproductive organ, made up of two main parts. You have the anther. The anther is the part of the male reproductive system that produces and holds pollen, and we'll talk about that. And then we also have the filament. So the filament's the structural support to chromosomes that undergoes meiosis. And from this meiosis process, it splits into 4 haploid cells containing one set of chromosomes. But this is an important part of when we're talking about natural selection and evolution. This is the part of the reproductive process where these alleles and genes get crossed over and we end up with some genetic diversity in the plant. So some of these resulting cells, after recombination of genes, end up with a diverse array of alleles from both parents. There. So that's the only important part about this, and we'll kind of zoom through. It goes over the Cells then go under mitosis, with creating eventually the pollen grain. And just important from this part is the pollen grain is made up of two parts, this tube cell, which we'll talk about, and the generative cell, which eventually becomes the sperm, which passes on this reproductive genetic material. And then next stage we're going to look at, so we got the pollen grain being the end kind of element of the male system. We're going to look at the female system. So again, this is the female reproductive system. Again, we start off with a diploid cell, same idea, undergoes meiosis, and we have that recombination of some of the genes, adding in some genetic diversity into these cells. Eventually, the cell undergoes mitosis, and we end up with this embryo sac within the ovary, within the ovule. And so we'll look at the next slide where this egg cell you'll see here is fertilized, creating the seed. And the seed, as we all know, of a fruit becomes this next generation of the plant. So if you plant a seed, it'll grow into the next generation of the plant. So this is the whole process here. We have the pollen grain lands on the sticky stigma up on top of the style. That tube cell we mentioned gets to work and creates a tube down to the ovules. And that generative cell in the pollen grain becomes two sperm that travel down this tube and eventually fertilize this egg, becoming the seed or the next generation of plant. So that's the very kind of crash course intro to what we're talking about when we're talking about flowering plant reproduction. And it's just important to know before we dive into natural selection and evolution of these plants, it's important to know how they reproduce, just to have an idea of that process, of how they're evolving. So also just kind of interesting to look at, if you see all flowering plants or most flowering plants create a fruit. So that ovary we talked about eventually becomes the fleshy fruit, and those ovules where the seed is formed eventually become the seeds. So a good way to look at this is on a tomato. You have this tomato fruit is a grown ovary, and the seeds are these fertilized seeds within the ovule. So you can see kind of what the evolution of that looks like through the reproductive process, which is interesting. And I won't belabor this too much, but one more thing is we have a lot of different types of flowering plants create fruits that maybe we don't think of as fruits. This is a dandelion, and this is actually the dandelion fruit. This is a cucumber, and then you can see the ovary here of the cucumber flower is expanding, and then you end up with the cucumber fruit. So just kind of interesting way of seeing the end result of the reproduction of a flowering plant. So after we know how plants reproduce, probably asking yourself, what role do pollinators play in this process? And how do these pollinators change the shape, color, structure of a flower? So what a pollinator does is a pollinator transports the pollen grain, from the male reproductive system of one plant to the female reproductive system of another. And there's a couple systems in which it does this. But you can see here it's a good example of a bee. So it's got a pollen sac right here. So it flies onto the stamen of one plant, picks up some pollen, either just gets stuck on its fur or it picks it up on a pollen sac. And then when it goes to another flower, it fertilizes that flower and reproduces that flower. So flowers have a huge incentive to attract pollinators to them because this is how they reproduce. So in the absence of these pollinators kind of flying in between and transferring the pollen to different plants, some plants use wind dispersal to fertilize the other plants, but these are mainly non-flowering plants that use this. So most flowering plants require pollinators. In fact, the flower on a plant is mostly evolved to attract these pollinators. And they do this in a couple ways. So one of the main ways that a flower attracts a pollinator is through the use of nectar, which you can see here in this nectary, which nectar is a sugary substance that pollinators can eat. So they'll go in there and they'll eat all this nectar, and they'll rub up against the anther, collecting pollen. And then when they eat the nectar of a like flower, they'll pollinate that flower and complete the reproductive process. And another way is these petals. So flowering plants, the existence of petals and colorful petals are there in place to attract these pollinators. So in many ways, this is kind of this first idea when we're thinking about the evolution of these plants to attract pollinators. The very existence of nectar in a plant is a good example of a plant that's evolved to attract a pollinator. So let's imagine you had a genetic mutation in a single plant that produced some sugary substance on the outside of that plant. There's just a random mutation, might not even be a lot of sugar, external sugary substance. But what happened is a lot of bees visited that plant, right? And so with a lot of bees visiting that plant, or a lot of pollinators visiting that plant, you have a lot of this pollen being transported to other plants, thereby passing on this allele or this to other plants, thereby expanding the number of plants and the species that express the trait of having this nectar. So it's kind of a slow process of the positive traits expanding on each other. Another great example is these purple dots on the flower. So as we'll learn about bees can see the UV spectrum, and they really are targeted towards purple colors. So again, let's say you had one single flower that had a genetic mutation that expressed purple coloration on its petals. That flower is going to get a lot of visits from bees. They'll see that from far away, and by doing so, they'll take a lot of the anther, a lot of the pollen from the anther, and transport it to other plants, thereby increasing the reproductive quality and amount of the plants that have this colorful mutation on them. So really, that's kind of the introduction to the natural selection evolution of these plants. And just think about how amazing these plants are, how lucky we are to have pollinators. Taking a step back, without pollinators and without these flowers that have evolved to attract pollinators, we'd have to do a lot of this work by hand. An interesting story currently in China is with large-scale agriculture, they've used so many pesticides, which pesticides kill a lot of insects that eat fruits and destroy plants. So this increased use of pesticides has killed a lot of the pollinator species in the area. And what people have to do is, it's actually cheaper for them to hand pollinate plants. Just imagine that. We have this free resource of pollinators that do this incredible job of reproducing and creating fruits for a lot of our agricultural systems. And without them, we'd have to go through by hand and pollinate. So pretty incredible things that they do. But getting back to the evolution of plants, I already touched on a bit on bee pollination with their attractiveness to UV spectrum light or colors. But we're going to dive into different pollinators and their preferences for different types of colors, shapes, or structures, and how that changes how a plant evolves. So the first example here is a hummingbird. I think this is a great one because if you look at these petals on this honeysuckle, you'll see, it's kind of the length of a hummingbird's beak, right? And that's no accident. The honeysuckle evolved to accommodate this pollinator. So the hummingbird will rub up on there, get the pollen from the one honeysuckle, and transfer it to another. But there's a couple other great mutations on this honeysuckle plant that have really kind of showcased this coevolution of preferences of the hummingbird in the structure and color of the flower. So another one is hummingbirds have a keen ability to see the color red, so you'll see more red plants. They have high metabolic needs, so they're always moving and they need a lot of nectar, so usually high nectar rewards in hummingbird plants. And they have the ability to hover, so a lot of the plants you see that attract hummingbirds will be either pointing horizontal or downward to accommodate hummingbirds' hovering abilities. And this is another, and so with all those kind of things in mind, here's another example of a plant that attracts hummingbirds. And this is kind of this perfect example where this tubular petals are the same length as a hummingbird beak. They're downward facing, they're red. Great example of a plant that has evolved to meet the preferences of a hummingbird. So they can see the red. So this one plant that perhaps has this red coloration is going to bring more hummingbirds to it, and that hummingbird is going to transfer its genes to other plants. Really interesting system. And we already talked briefly about bees, but we're going to go a little bit farther into there. So bees, as I mentioned, they can see the ultraviolet spectrum of light. So you'll see more purple-colored plants with bees. They also have a preference for bilateral symmetry in plants. So this is a good example. You'll end up with symmetry across both axes in these plants. Also, they're attracted to yellow and blue and bell-shaped flowers. So these are all kind of examples of bee preferences. So you'll see a lot of yellow or purple bell-shaped flowers that are attractive to bee pollination, which is super interesting. And they also take nectar. So another interesting thing about bee pollinated plants is they'll have these nectar guides, they call them, which are, you can see this red on here, these spots that really guide the bees through the nectar. So if you see lines, here's another example of purple leading to the nectary. Those are bee pollinated plants. There's another example, getting back to where we first started. This is a naturally selected flower that has evolved to attract bees based on shape of bee. So kind of tricking it into reproducing with a fake bee to transfer the pollen to another plant. And then finally, we'll end on butterflies. So butterflies, for larger breeds of butterflies, they're these larger insects, so they require bigger landing pads to land on. So you'll see these larger umbrellas of flowers for butterfly pollinated flowers. They also require nectar rewards, so you'll see nectar in there, and they enjoy bright colors. So these are all examples of, you can walk around and you'll see plants, purple plants. You can be like, oh, that's probably bee pollinated based on what I know about bee preferences. This plant has evolved its structure to accommodate those preferences, which is super interesting. So for today's assignment, it's a really brief assignment, but I've assigned a series of 3 Montana native wildflowers that you'll actually see while hiking around. I've also left the trail map in the description below if you want to go hiking and looking for some of these flowers. But your assignment is to pick one of these 3, so either the common yarrow on the left, the harebell, or the Indian paintbrush, and give me a 2-sentence hypothesis on the Google form of what pollinator do you expect to pollinate this species of flower, and based on structure, color, and shape, why do you think that? So I appreciate you guys joining me for today's lesson. I hope you learned something good. Yeah, and happy learning, happy exploring, everyone. Thanks.